Jake Miller stared at the contract on his datapad and wondered if he'd finally lost his mind. The words glowed in front of him, mocking every survival instinct he had left. Personal chef to the Scarith royal family. Duration 30 standard days. Compensation 500,000 credits. 500,000 credits. That number could wipe out his student loans, pay off his mom's medical bills, and maybe, just maybe, give him enough to start over somewhere nobody knew he'd flamed out of every decent restaurant on Mars Colony. The problem was the fine print. The part that said the Scarith princes consumed chefs who disappointed them. Literally. As in, roasted alive and eaten as a lesson to others. "You're actually considering this?" his roommate Tyler had said when Jake first showed him the posting. "Dude, they're dragons. Actual fire-breathing, 6-ton murder lizards who think humans are basically cockroaches with delusions of grandeur." Tyler wasn't wrong. The Scarith Empire controlled 40 star systems and had a reputation that made hardened Alliance soldiers nervous. Their diplomatic tours were legendary, not for successful negotiations, but for the trail of destroyed careers and occasionally incinerated staff they left behind. But Jake was desperate. 3 years ago he'd left Earth with big dreams. He was going to be a chef, a real one, at those fancy stations where politicians and corporate executives paid a month's salary for a single meal. Instead, he'd washed dishes, prepped vegetables, and gotten fired from 6 different kitchens for lacking vision. Turns out, cooking food people actually wanted to eat wasn't visionary enough. So when the Galactic Culinary Institute sent out an emergency request for a chef willing to serve the 3 Scarith princes during their diplomatic tour, Jake hit accept before his brain could stop his fingers. Now, standing in the kitchen of Diplomatic Station Harmony 7, he was pretty sure his brain had been right to be concerned. The kitchen was massive, easily 4 times bigger than any Jake had worked in. Gleaming metal surfaces stretched in every direction. Equipment he didn't recognize hummed and blinked with alien purpose. The ceiling arched 30 feet overhead, reinforced with blast-resistant panels. That should have been his first clue. The previous chef, a Vrelian named something Jake couldn't pronounce, had apparently quit via escape pod 3 days into the job. Before that, a crystalline master chef had lasted 6 days before requesting an emergency medical evacuation for psychological trauma. The kitchen staff consisted of 5 trill workers, insect-like aliens about 4 feet tall with way too many arms, and 2 Vorp assistants who looked like nervous piles of blue jello. They watched Jake unpack his single storage container with expressions that ranged from pity to horror. "That's it?" one of the trill chittered, his translator collar rendering his speech in flat, emotionless English. "Those are your supplies?" Jake looked down at his carefully packed ingredients. Salt, black pepper, butter, flour, olive oil, garlic. Fresh herbs he'd managed to grow in his tiny apartment. Some spices his grandmother had given him before he'd left Earth. Basic stuff. Real stuff. "Yeah," Jake said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "This is what I work with." The trill exchanged looks with his companions. One of the Vorp made a sound like a deflating balloon, apparently their version of a sigh. "The Scarith princes experience food through 7 sensory dimensions," another trill explained slowly, like Jake might be simple. "They taste electromagnetic resonance. They perceive temporal flavor profiles. They sense quantum entanglement in molecular structures. You brought seasoning." "Good seasoning," Jake muttered, but nobody seemed impressed. The head chef, a trill named Kixip, pulled up a holographic display. 3 dragons materialized in miniature above the counter. Prince Corvin, eldest son and heir to the Scarith throne. Prince Drace, military commander of the 4th Fleet. Princess Ember, diplomatic liaison and reportedly the most dangerous of the 3. The hologram showed massive creatures, easily 20 feet long, covered in scales that shimmered with colors Jake didn't have names for. Their eyes glowed with intelligence and something else. Hunger maybe. Or contempt. "They arrive in 4 hours, Kixip continued. "First meal is expected by evening cycle." Previous chefs attempted to impress them with delicacies. Quantum-aged proteins. Void-caught nebula essence. Meals that took months to prepare. "And?" Jake asked. Prince Corvin incinerated the last 3 meals without tasting them. Said they were insulting. Jake felt his stomach drop. What exactly do they want? Kixip's antenna drooped. Nobody knows. That's the problem. The Scarith have the most sophisticated palates in known space. They've evolved beyond simple taste. What you humans do, putting cooked meat and plants in your mouth, that's primitive to them. It's like asking a symphony conductor to appreciate someone banging rocks together. The other staff members had gone back to their prep work, but Jake could feel them watching him. Waiting for him to crack. Waiting for him to run like the smart people before him. His hands were shaking slightly as he organized his ingredients. 500,000 credits. 30 days. 3 dragons who might kill him if his cooking wasn't good enough. Tyler had been right. He'd definitely lost his mind. But Jake had one advantage nobody seemed to have considered. He'd spent 3 years cooking for people who had everything, and he'd learned that having everything meant you'd forgotten what it felt like to just enjoy something simple and real. Maybe dragons weren't so different. Or maybe he'd be ashes by morning. Either way, Jake Miller started prepping his first meal. Jake's hands moved on autopilot as he prepared the chicken. Season it. Let it rest. Get the oven to the right temperature. It was muscle memory at this point, the kind of cooking he'd done 1,000 times in his mom's kitchen back in Ohio before culinary school convinced him he needed to be fancier. The Trill staff watched from a safe distance, their multiple arms twitching nervously. Kixip kept checking his datapad like he was timing how long until disaster struck. "You're really making that?" one of the VoRP assistants gurgled. The translator made it sound almost like a question, but Jake could hear the disbelief. "Roasted chicken," Jake confirmed, sliding the bird into the oven. "With mashed potatoes, roasted carrots, and fresh bread. The Scarith princes have consumed meals prepared by the finest molecular gastronomists in the galaxy," Kixip said quietly. "Master Chef Vrel once served them protein restructured at the quantum level. They burned it to ash without a second glance." Jake shrugged and started peeling potatoes. What else could he do? He didn't know how to cook in 17 dimensions. He didn't have equipment that could manipulate time or quantum whatever. He had an oven, some pots, and ingredients that would have been at home in any kitchen from 300 years ago. "Maybe that's the problem," Jake muttered. "What?" "Nothing. Just talking to myself." The truth was, Jake had a theory. It was probably a stupid theory that was going to get him killed, but it was all he had. During his 3 years bouncing between fancy restaurants, he'd noticed something. The richer the customers, the more complicated the food, the less they actually seemed to enjoy eating. They'd analyze it, photograph it, talk about it, but that moment of just savoring something good? That was gone. Maybe dragons had the same problem. 2 hours later, the kitchen smelled exactly like Sunday dinner at his mom's house. Roasted chicken with crispy skin. Butter mashed potatoes with just a hint of garlic. Carrots glazed with honey. Bread that was still warm from the oven. The kitchen staff had gone completely silent. Even the equipment seemed quieter, like the whole station was holding its breath. "They're entering the dining hall," Kixip announced, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake plated 3 meals with steady hands. Simple white plates. No garnish sculptures. No foam. No artistic smears of sauce that looked like someone had sneezed colorfully. Just food that looked like food. He pushed the cart toward the dining hall himself. The staff looked at him like he was walking to his own execution. The dining hall was ridiculous. 30-foot ceilings. A table made from a single piece of some alien crystal that probably cost more than Jake's entire education. And at that table sat 3 dragons. They were bigger in person. Prince Corvin's scales were deep crimson with edges that seemed to catch light in impossible ways. Prince Drace was midnight blue with silver markings. Princess Ember was smaller but somehow more intimidating, her golden scales reflecting the light like living metal. All 3 sets of eyes locked onto Jake as he wheeled the cart in. He felt analyzed, measured, and probably found wanting in about 2 seconds. "Your meal, your highnesses," Jake said, managing to keep his voice steady. He placed a plate in front of each prince. Corvin looked down at the food. His lip curled, revealing teeth that could bite through starship hull plating. "This is what you bring us? This primitive offering?" "It's roasted chicken with mashed potatoes," Jake said. "And yes, it's simple. But it's good." "Good," Corvin repeated like the word was an insult. Drace snorted, a sound that came out as a puff of smoke. Ember just stared at Jake with those unsettling golden eyes. Kixip and the other staff had followed at a distance, probably to witness Jake's death and report it properly. Jake could feel their terror from across the room. Corvin picked up his fork. The dragons had insisted on using utensils, apparently to seem more civilized, and speared a piece of chicken. He held it up, examining it like a scientist studying a particularly boring specimen. Then he ate it. For 3 seconds nothing happened. Corvin's expression didn't change. Drace and Ember watched their brother, waiting for his verdict. Then Corvin went absolutely still. His eyes widened. The glow in them flickered, dimmed, and changed to something Jake didn't recognize. The dragon's massive head tilted slightly, like he was listening to something far away. "Brother?" Ember said quietly. Corvin didn't respond. He took another bite. Then another. His movements were slow, deliberate, like he was experiencing something he couldn't quite process. Drace and Ember exchanged a glance, then looked down at their own plates. Curious now. Maybe concerned. Ember tried the mashed potatoes. Her reaction was slower but just as profound. Her scales seemed to dim slightly, and when she looked up at Jake, there was something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Confusion. Wonder. And something else that looked almost like pain. Drace cut into his chicken. He chewed slowly. Swallowed. Reached for the bread without a word. The silence stretched out. Jake stood there, unsure if he should leave or stay or maybe just start running. The kitchen staff was frozen behind him. Then, without speaking, all three princes kept eating. No comments. No critiques. They just ate like the food required their complete attention. Jake watched Prince Corvin's claws, each one sharp enough to slice through steel, carefully cut another piece of chicken. The massive dragon who could level a city was eating mashed potatoes like they were the most important thing in the universe. 15 minutes later, all three plates were empty. Not a scrap left. The bread was gone. Even the little bit of juice from the chicken had been soaked up. Corvin looked at Jake. For a terrifying moment, Jake thought this was it, the part where he got incinerated for insulting them with his primitive earth food. But Corvin just said, "Tomorrow evening. Same time." Then all three princes stood and left the dining hall without another word. Jake stood there, still holding the empty cart, trying to figure out what had just happened. Kixip approached slowly, his antenna quivering. They ate it. All of it. Yeah, Jake said quietly. They did. What Jake couldn't know, was that the meal had triggered something in the dragon's complex sensory system. The electromagnetic signature of his cooking, unprocessed and simple, had resonated with memories buried so deep they'd almost forgotten they existed. Memories of being hatchlings. Of safety. Of a time before the Empire, before conquest, before everything became about power and dominance. Jake Miller had accidentally served them something no galactic chef had thought to offer. He'd served them comfort. And for the first time in centuries, the Scarith princes had actually felt something other than ambition and pride. Ambassador Chin Rodriguez was the first to notice something was off. She'd been negotiating with the Scarith Empire for 6 years, and she knew their patterns like she knew her own heartbeat. Day 3 of any diplomatic meeting, Prince Corvin would make an impossible demand. Day 5, Princess Ember would threaten to walk out. Day 7, Prince Drace would challenge someone to single combat just to prove a point. It was theater, but dangerous theater. The kind that had ended 3 previous treaty attempts in complete disaster. But here they were 12 days into talks and the princes were different. Did Corvin just agree to a compromise? Ambassador Lee whispered during a brief recess. He looked genuinely shocked, like he'd just watched physics stop working. Without demanding we surrender 2 colonies first, Chin Rodriguez confirmed. She pulled up her notes, scanning through them like she'd missed something. And Ember hasn't threatened anyone in 4 days. She's actually been reasonable? Across the conference room, Princess Ember was discussing trade routes with a junior diplomat, actually listening to his points instead of dismissing him. Her usual aggressive posture had softened. She still looked like she could tear someone in half. She was a dragon after all, but the constant simmering rage that normally surrounded her like a force field had diminished. What changed? Lee asked. Chin Rodriguez had been asking herself the same question. She checked everything. New intelligence reports. Shifts in Scarith politics back home. Some kind of leverage the Alliance didn't know about. But there was nothing. The only new variable was the human chef, and that seemed ridiculous. How could food change anything? But that evening, when she saw Jake Miller wheeling a cart of dinner toward the prince's private quarters, she decided to follow at a distance. Jake had settled into a routine. Every evening, same time, he'd prepare meals that would have been ordinary on Earth but were apparently revolutionary here. Tonight was beef stew with fresh bread and a simple salad. The kitchen staff still watched him like he was performing magic tricks they couldn't understand. Kixip had stopped questioning his methods around day 4, after Prince Corvin had personally requested that Jake remain as their chef for the entire diplomatic mission. That kind of request from a Scarith prince was unheard of. Usually, they went through chefs like other people went through napkins. Smells good, one of the Vorp assistants gurgled as Jake ladled stew into bowls. After 2 weeks, Jake had learned that was high praise from Glorp. The Vorp didn't have much of a sense of smell, so if even he noticed, it meant the kitchen was filled with the kind of aroma that stuck to everything. Jake had made this stew dozens of times. It was his dad's recipe, the one he'd make on cold Michigan nights when the snow was piling up outside. Beef, carrots, potatoes, onions, tomatoes. Simple ingredients that turned into something bigger than the sum of their parts if you gave them enough time. That was the secret Jake had learned. Time. Patience. Not rushing things just to seem impressive. The fancy restaurants he'd failed at, they'd all been about speed and spectacle. 17 ingredients on a plate, each one demanding attention, none of them actually working together. It looked amazing in photos but tasted like confusion. The stew? Tasted like a story. Like coming home. Like someone cared enough to spend hours making sure it was right. Jake was cleaning up when he heard the kitchen door open. He turned, expecting Kixip or maybe one of the Trill coming back for supplies. Instead, Prince Drace stood in the doorway. The dragon had to duck to fit through the entrance. Even crouched, he dominated the space, his midnight blue scales catching the kitchen lights. His eyes, intelligent and ancient, fixed on Jake. The kitchen staff scattered. Glorp made a sound like a squeaky toy and oozed behind a storage unit. Kixip's antenna went flat against his head as he backed toward the far wall. Jake's heart hammered, but he stayed put. Running seemed like a bad idea. "Your Highness," Jake managed. "Did you need something?" Drace moved further into the kitchen, his movements careful and controlled. He wasn't threatening, at least Jake didn't think so. But having a 20-foot dragon in your workspace was naturally intimidating, regardless of intent. "The stew," Drace said. His voice was deep, resonant, the kind that you felt in your chest. "From tonight." "Yeah," Jake said. "Was something wrong with it?" "No." Drace's head tilted slightly, studying Jake with an intensity that made him want to hide behind the nearest counter. "It reminded me of something. A memory I had forgotten." Jake waited. "You didn't interrupt dragons. That seemed like basic survival instinct. When we were hatchlings," Drace continued slowly, like he was working through a difficult problem, "before the succession wars. Before our father died and everything became about power and position. Corvin, Ember, and I would hunt together in the breeding grounds. Not for status. Not for training. Just, together." The dragon paused, looking at nothing in particular. "Your stew reminded me of those days. Of when we were not rivals. When we were simply brothers." Drace's eyes focused back on Jake. "How did you do that?" Jake thought about his answer carefully. "It's beef stew," he said finally. "Takes about 4 hours to make properly. You can't rush it. The flavors need time to work together, to become something bigger than they started as. If you hurry it, if you try to force it, it falls apart." The kitchen was silent except for the hum of equipment. Drace stared at Jake for a long moment. Then the dragon made a sound, a low rumble that might have been a laugh or might have been something else entirely. "You cannot rush it," Drace repeated. "Time to work together. To become something bigger." He nodded slowly. "Yes, I understand." He wasn't talking about stew anymore. Jake realized that, watching understanding dawn in those ancient eyes. Drace turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Tomorrow, Chef Jake. I would like to learn how you make bread." Then he was gone, leaving Jake standing in his kitchen, wondering what had just happened. Behind the storage unit, Glorp finally emerged. Did that dragon just ask for cooking lessons? Jake looked at the empty doorway. "I think so." Something was changing. Not just with the negotiations but with the princes themselves. And somehow, impossibly, Jake's simple human cooking was at the center of it. Retry. Life has this funny way of testing you right when you think you've got everything figured out. You wake up one morning feeling confident, ready to take on the world, and then boom, something happens that shakes everything you believed in. That's exactly what happened next, and honestly nobody saw it coming. Everything was going smoothly. The plans were in place, the hard work was paying off, and success seemed just around the corner. But here's the thing about life, it doesn't care about your plans. It doesn't wait for you to be ready before throwing a curveball your way. And this curveball was massive. The first sign that something was wrong came on a regular Tuesday afternoon. You know those moments when your gut tells you something's off, but you can't quite put your finger on it? That uncomfortable feeling in your stomach that makes you want to look over your shoulder? Yeah, it was one of those moments. The air felt different, heavier somehow, like the calm before a storm. And then it happened. The obstacle that had been lurking in the shadows finally showed itself, and it was bigger and more complicated than anyone could have imagined. All those carefully laid plans suddenly seemed fragile, like a house of cards ready to collapse with one wrong move. The confidence that had been building up for weeks started to crack, replaced by doubt and uncertainty. But here's what makes this interesting. The reaction wasn't what you'd expect. There was no immediate panic, no dramatic breakdown. Instead, there was this moment of stillness, this pause where everything seemed to freeze. It's like time slowed down just enough to let the reality of the situation sink in. And in that moment, a choice had to be made. Give up or fight back. The easy option was right there, staring everyone in the face. Walk away, accept defeat, pretend like none of it ever mattered. Nobody would have blamed anyone for taking that route. Sometimes the smart thing to do is to cut your losses and move on. But something inside refused to accept that outcome. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was just the unwillingness to let all that hard work go to waste. So the decision was made. Fight back. Push forward. Find a way through this mess no matter what it takes. But saying it and doing it are two completely different things, and reality set in pretty quickly. This wasn't going to be some quick fix or easy solution. This was going to require everything: energy, time, creativity, and a whole lot of courage. The first attempts to overcome the challenge were rough. Really rough. Every strategy that seemed brilliant in theory fell apart in practice. Every door that looked promising led to another dead end. It felt like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces, or running a race with weights tied to your ankles. Progress was slow, frustrating, and at times, it felt completely impossible. Nights became longer. Sleep became harder to come by. That voice in the back of the mind kept getting louder, the one that whispers all your fears and doubts. What if this is a mistake? What if you're not good enough? What if everyone was right when they said it couldn't be done? Those thoughts are dangerous because they sound so reasonable, so logical, so much like common sense. But then something unexpected happened. In the middle of all that struggle and frustration, a small breakthrough appeared. Not a solution, not even close, but a tiny crack in the wall that seemed impossible to climb. It was just enough to spark a bit of hope, just enough to prove that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't completely hopeless after all. That small victory changed everything. It didn't make the challenge disappear, but it shifted the perspective. Instead of looking at this massive, overwhelming obstacle, it became possible to see it as a series of smaller problems that could be tackled one at a time. The mountain didn't get any smaller, but the path to climb it became clearer. The struggle continued, day after day, with tiny steps forward and occasional steps back. But something had changed inside. The fear was still there, the doubt hadn't vanished, but they weren't in control anymore. There was a new determination, a refusal to be beaten that grew stronger with each small victory, no matter how insignificant it seemed. And as the days turned into weeks, something remarkable started to happen. The impossible challenge that once seemed like a dead end was slowly, painfully beginning to crack. Not because of some magical solution or stroke of genius, but through sheer persistence and the unwillingness to give up. The real battle wasn't against the obstacle itself. It was against the urge to quit when things got hard. The moment of truth had arrived. The grand hall was filled to capacity with creatures from every corner of the realm, all gathered to witness this historic event. You could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone was whispering, speculating, placing bets on what would happen next. This wasn't just any ordinary competition anymore. It had become the talk of the entire kingdom. The first competitor stepped forward with confidence that bordered on arrogance. Years of experience and mastery were evident in every movement, every gesture. The presentation began, and honestly, it was breathtaking. What unfolded before everyone's eyes was nothing short of spectacular, a creation so intricate, so beautifully crafted, that it seemed almost impossible that mortal hands could have made it. The display was pure artistry. Colors danced and swirled in ways that defied logic. Flavors were layered with such precision that each bite told a different story. The presentation alone took nearly an hour, and throughout it all, the audience sat mesmerized. Some people couldn't hold back their emotions. Tears rolled down their faces as they witnessed something they'd never seen before. This was mastery at its finest, the kind of skill that comes from dedicating an entire lifetime to perfecting a craft. The applause was thunderous. People stood, cheering, convinced they had just witnessed the winning performance. How could anyone possibly top that? It seemed impossible, ridiculous even to try. The bar had been set so high that it touched the clouds. Then came the turn of the underdog, the one nobody expected to stand a chance. While others had brought elaborate equipment and exotic ingredients from distant lands, this competitor wheeled out something so simple it made people do a double take. A plain wooden cart, nothing fancy about it. No gold decorations, no mystical glow, just honest, simple wood. On that cart sat 3 plain ceramic bowls. Steam rose from them, carrying a scent that was familiar yet somehow comforting. Next to the bowls lay a loaf of freshly baked bread, golden brown and still warm from the oven. That was it. No elaborate presentation, no dramatic flair, no exotic ingredients that cost more than most people earned in a year. The grand chamber, which moments ago had been filled with excited chatter and applause, suddenly went completely silent. You could hear a pin drop. People looked at each other in confusion, wondering if this was some kind of joke. The previous competitor actually started laughing, a sound that echoed through the hall. Others joined in, nervous giggles spreading through the crowd like wildfire. The judges sat at their high table, their faces showing clear bewilderment. They leaned toward each other, whispering frantically, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. This was the grand competition, the event of the century, and someone had brought out what looked like peasant food? The kind of simple meal that common folks ate every single day? It seemed absurd, almost disrespectful. But the rules were clear. Every entry had to be tasted and judged fairly, no matter how simple or complex. So the three royal judges, these powerful beings who had tasted delicacies from across 1,000 worlds, who had eaten meals prepared by the greatest chefs in history, reluctantly approached the simple cart. They picked up their spoons with visible skepticism. The audience held its breath, waiting for the inevitable dismissal, the polite rejection that would end this embarrassing display. The judges dipped their spoons into the bowls, lifting the simple broth to their lips. And then something happened that nobody in that hall had ever witnessed before, something that went against everything they knew about these powerful, ancient beings. As the first taste touched their tongues, all three judges froze. Their eyes widened in shock, then slowly closed. And then, impossibly, tears began streaming down their faces. These weren't just any beings. These were creatures known throughout the realms for their strength, their pride, their absolute inability to show such vulnerable emotion. In thousands of years of recorded history, no one had ever seen them cry. Not during wars, not during tragedies, not during any circumstance whatsoever. It simply didn't happen. It couldn't happen. But it was happening now. The tears flowed freely as they took another spoonful, then another. Their hands trembled slightly as they reached for the bread, tearing off pieces and dipping them into the broth. With each bite, more tears came, accompanied by expressions that shifted between joy and something deeper, something that looked almost like pain mixed with profound relief. The laughter in the hall died instantly. The smug confidence evaporated like morning mist. Everyone leaned forward, trying to understand what was happening, what could possibly cause such a reaction. This was just soup, simple soup with noodles and chicken, the kind of thing that grandmothers made when you were sick, the kind of comfort food that had no business being in a royal competition. But clearly it wasn't just soup. Clearly, something else was happening here, something that went far beyond ingredients and cooking techniques. The judges continued eating in silence, and the entire hall watched in absolute stunned disbelief as these powerful beings experienced something that no elaborate creation, no matter how magnificent, had ever managed to achieve. The first competitor's laughter had turned into shocked silence, the confidence completely drained away. Because in that moment, everyone realized they were witnessing something unexpected, something that changed everything they thought they knew about what truly mattered.